now we are going to start translating our jQuery code structure into actual jQuery code. So we're going to start by defining our variables. So we're going to start with the app mode. Okay. So as mentioned before, we're going to have two app modes, off and on. And once we click on the start button, the app mode is going to be on. So we're going to define a Boolean mode. So it's going to be false at the beginning. Okay. So we can also use 0 and 1 rather than false and true, which is exactly the same. Okay. Now let's create our time counter variable. So this variable is going to count the number of centiseconds that elapsed since the beginning. So the way it's going to work is that we're going to be counting how many centiseconds elapsed, and we're going to convert that to minutes, seconds, centiseconds. Okay? So it's like counting the number of seconds and converting that to hours, minutes, and seconds. It's exactly the same. Okay? So we're going to call this variable time counter, and it's going to start at 0 at the beginning. We're going to do the same thing for the lap counter, okay, which is going to correspond to the values of the lap counter. And we're going to call it lap counter. Okay, so the first one is for time, and the second one is for the current lap. Okay, now we're going to define another variable which is going to be used for the setInterval function. So as you would have guessed, we are going to use the setInterval function, okay, as we are dealing here with timing events. And as we've done before in the maths game and also in the fruits game, we're going to use a variable where we're going to store the outputs of the setInterval function. And we're going to come back to this later. Okay, now we need the number of laps. So we're going to need that number to specify which lap we are printing here. Okay, so variable lap number. So it's going to start at 0 at the beginning. And finally, we're going to need a few variables, minutes, seconds, centiseconds, which are going to correspond to the values of our time counter and lap counter. Okay, so when we get the time counter variable, we are going to convert that to 3 variables, the minutes, seconds, and centiseconds, or we're looking here, the minutes, seconds, and centiseconds of the time. And similarly, when we get the lap counter, we're going to convert that to minutes, seconds, and centiseconds of the lap. Okay, so we're going to have three variables for each, 3 for time and 3 for lap. So we're going to have time minutes, and then time seconds. Okay, so we can define all variables in one go like this. It's okay to do it like this. And then time centiseconds. And then similarly for the lap, we're going to have lap minutes, lap seconds, and lap centiseconds. And just make sure you spell these right, just to avoid having any errors later on in the code. Okay. Now we're gonna move to what happens when we load the app. So when we load our app, we are going to show only 2 buttons. So in total, we have 5 buttons. So to show 2 buttons, there is a nice trick we can do here. We're going to hide all the buttons. Okay. And then we are going to show only 2, the ones that we want. So for this, we're going to use a function. Okay. We're going to call it hide show buttons. This function is going to take a couple of parameters. It's going to take the IDs of the buttons we want to show. Okay, so in our case, we want to show the start button and the lab button. If you remember, the IDs of these buttons were start button, okay, and lab button. Okay, now let's define this function at the end. So it's going to take a couple of parameters. So I'm going to call them x and y. Okay. Given that x and y represent the IDs of the elements we want to show, including the number sign. Okay. All right. So to hide all the buttons, we are going to hide all the elements of class control. Okay. So we're going to access these elements using their class, okay, which is control, and then we're going to hide them using the hide method. And after that, we're going to show the two elements which we have in the parameters, so x and y. Okay. I'm just going to have a quick look at this curly brackets, which belongs to the document ready function. It's going to need a parenthesis at the end and a semicolon. Okay. So now let's save our code and make sure this is working. Perfect. So we've got only the start and lab button when we load the page. All right. Let's continue our code. So now we're going to write code corresponding to clicking on the start button. So we're going to do a few things. We're going to set the mode to on. Okay, so before we do that, let's access the start button using its ID. Start button. Okay, and then we're going to use the click method. And inside this method, we're going to have a function to execute. Okay, and let's write our code in there. So first we're going to set the mode to on. We can do that by setting the variable mode to 1. And then we're going to show the stop and lab buttons. Again, we're going to use the hide show buttons function. So this time we are going to show stop and lab. Okay. And then we're going to start the counter. And for this, we're going to use another function that I'm going to call start action. Okay. So let's define this function at the end. Okay. Let's add a few comments for these functions. So this one shows 2 buttons. Okay, and the following one is going to start the counter, and I'm going to call it start action. Okay, so this function is going to increase our counters by 1 every 10 milliseconds. Okay, so our counters are the time counter and the lab counter, which are the variables we're going to need later to convert to these values, minutes, seconds, and centiseconds. Okay, so a second would go up by 1 every second, a millisecond would go up by 1 every millisecond, but a centisecond is going to go up by 1 every 10 milliseconds. Okay, so to increase the time counter by 1, we're going to use the syntax time counter plus plus, and the same thing for the lab counter. Okay. But we're not going to do this straight away. We want to do this every 10 milliseconds. So we're going to need a time event function or a timing event function, which is going to be set interval. So what we're going to do, we're going to set our variable action that we said earlier, we're going to use for the set interval function. And we're going to set it to the output of the set interval function. So again, if you remember, this function is going to take a couple of parameters, a function in the first parameter, okay, and a duration in milliseconds in the second parameter. And we were saying it's going to be every 10 milliseconds. So every 10 milliseconds, what we're going to do, we're going to increase our time counter by 1 and our lap counter by 1. And then we are going to convert these numbers into minutes, seconds, and centiseconds and update the time inside these elements. So I'm going to use another function for this. I'm going to call it update time just to make our code more readable. Okay. Now let's define this function, update time. So it's going to convert counters to minutes, seconds, and centiseconds. Okay. So let's start with the time counter, okay? And let's convert the time counter into these values. So we know that inside 1 minute, we've got 60 seconds, okay? And inside 1 second, we've got 100 centiseconds. So 1 minute is the equivalent of 60 multiplied by 100 centiseconds, okay? Which is 6,000 centiseconds. Okay, so to get the number of minutes, we're going to need to divide the number of centiseconds by 6,000. Okay, so the variable time minutes, okay, we're going to set it to the time counter divided by 6,000. Okay, but we want a whole number here, so we're going to use math floor to get the right value. All right.